The war in Gaza is a transformative moment in global affairs, similar to 9/11. What's happening right now will have long-lasting effects on international relations in the exact same way that 9/11 did. So I think these are very important. This is a very important time. We should pay close attention to it. And sadly, the United States is responsible under Joe Biden for making this situation much worse rather than better. In many ways, the United States under Joe Biden is part of the problem that we're seeing today in our world, specifically with respect to the Middle East. So this is a very pessimistic and dark moment for everyone. Last week, Joe Biden gave an interview to CNN where he announced that the United States would temporarily halt the sale of heavy payload weapons to Israel. These 2,000-pound and 500-pound bunker bombs, which create huge devastation, have been used in Gaza over the last 7 months because of differences of opinion over the invasion of the Palestinian town in Gaza known as Rafah. So he announced that as a new U.S. policy, which effectively meant that the United States would still be selling arms to Israel. There was no comprehensive ban. It was only those limited weapons that create huge devastation that Joe Biden announced he would not be selling to Israel. Yesterday, it was revealed in the Washington Post that the United States has proceeded with another $1 billion in new weapons sales to Israel. So when you put that all together, not much has changed, which in many ways undermines the premise of your question that somehow some people are, I think, mistakenly believing that the United States has halted weapons sales to Israel. That is not the case whatsoever. All we know and all we can be certain about is that the United States, for a short period of time, is no longer sending those heavy payload weapons that I just described. The United States still backs Israel, almost 100%. I think the interview that Biden gave that I just referenced, objectively speaking, means that U.S. policy toward Israel has shifted from 100% ironclad support to 99% ironclad support. So it's a very minor and insignificant shift, all things considered. And I don't think we need to exaggerate what's going on. What's interesting about what Biden said in his CNN interview, announcing a very limited sale in Israeli weapons, American weapons to Israel, is that he openly acknowledged that these weapons have been used in the past to kill innocent civilians in population centers. This is the second time that Joe Biden has openly acknowledged the killing of civilians in Gaza with American weapons. Before, he had used the term that Israel was responsible for, quote, indiscriminate bombings in Gaza. And what that effectively means is that Joe Biden himself has openly acknowledged that the United States is complicit in war crimes, because attacking population centers where civilians are living and to engage in, quote, indiscriminate bombings is a violation of international humanitarian law. And the United States president, the commander-in-chief, is openly acknowledging that these policies are being pursued with American weapons, knowing the consequences of what is being done with these American weapons. So in many ways, the United States is now so complicit, so blatantly and openly complicit in what Israel is doing in Gaza, that it's willing to brag about it. It's willing to sort of openly display its defiance of international law and its direct complicity with Israeli war crimes, knowing that there's going to be no consequences because the United States is the most powerful country in the world. And I think these stories that I'm talking about, based on interviews that Joe Biden has given, really highlights how the horror show that we're seeing in Gaza is really accurately described not just as an Israeli horror show and an Israeli attempt at what the UN court has called a plausible case of genocide, but it's really an American and Israeli war effort that is replete with war crimes. Everyone knows, it's been openly stated by Israeli leaders and Israeli generals, that if tomorrow the United States would simply cut off comprehensively the supply of weapons to Israel, it would not be able to prosecute its war in Gaza. And so in that sense, the United States bears full moral responsibility for the situation in Gaza. And I think any war crimes prosecutor would have a very easy case to make before a court of judges making an argument for American complicity in war crimes in Gaza. The United States claims that it has, what's interesting about this situation is that the United States, after its failure in Iraq and its failure in Afghanistan, wanted to pull out of the Middle East. It was tired of wars. There's now a broad national consensus in the United States on both sides of the political divide and within American society that the United States should not be involved in any more wars in the Middle East. Joe Biden came into office announcing that he wanted to reduce America's presence in the Middle East. That's why he pulled out troops from Afghanistan in a very disastrous way. But then October the 7th happened, and a U.S. policy was turned not only upside down, but inside out. Instead of pulling out of the Middle East, the United States has now been drawn back into the Middle East militarily and politically. And this has to do specifically with one of the pillars of post-World War II U.S. foreign policy, one of the pillars of post-World War II American foreign policy in the Middle East, and that is supporting Israel as a major ally of the United States in the region. The United States, from a geopolitical perspective, from a strategic perspective, views Israel as an aircraft carrier, what's often called a reliable, stable aircraft carrier where the United States can project its power in the region. And because of that dimension of American support, there's other reasons why the United States is so solidly supportive of Israel, but strictly from a national security perspective, the United States believes that Israel has to be protected and supported and not punished for its behavior. And so when a major event happens like October the 7th, there are very powerful arguments within the American foreign policy establishment that Israel needs to win its military battles with its adversaries, in this case Hamas, but also Hezbollah and Iran, and the United States should back it. What's interesting, though, is that roughly a month ago, in mid-April, there was a very big concern that Israel and Iran were headed toward a war. When there was an exchange, when Iran fired hundreds of drones and missiles toward Israel in response to Israel's ongoing attack on major Iranian assets throughout the Middle East. And there was big concern that we were headed toward a war. The United States drew a line and told Israel that it would not support an Israeli offensive position toward Iran. It would not get dragged into a war that Israel wants to see with Iran, with American backing, but it would protect Israel if Israel was attacked by Iran. And so in that sense, the United States is, I think, trying to send some message to Israel that it would protect Israel when it's attacked from its adversaries, but would not support an extension of the war in Gaza to the broader region, specifically with respect to Iran. So the United States is sort of in this position where it wants to maintain its hegemony in the Middle East, but it doesn't want to see an expansion of the war that we're seeing in Gaza today? Well, we don't know for sure how this is going to play out, but there's a wide assumption now based on polling that Joe Biden has now lost a lot of support from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and particularly young people. The college protests that have rocked this country since roughly about a month ago is a reflection that young people in this country are deeply angry with Joe Biden. And Joe Biden's problem with young people is the following. Joe Biden claims that in contrast to Donald Trump, he is a man of ethics, that he is a man of political principle, that Joe Biden allegedly cares about human life, about human rights, about democracy. But when you look at what Joe Biden is doing in Gaza, it's very hard to find any moral principles that are worth bragging about. I mean, Joe Biden looks almost indistinguishable from the position of Donald Trump, and young people can see the hypocrisy and the double standard, and how Joe Biden now is, deeply complicit in the horrors of Gaza. So that has disillusioned a lot of young people. I predict many of them are not going to vote for the Democratic Party. Many of them are going to stay home. And in several of those key swing states, that could make the difference in determining the outcome of the election. For those people who know anything about the American electoral system, it's not a national election, but it's a state-by-state election. And there's about 5 or 6 states that are considered to be swing states that will determine the outcome of the November election. And in all of those swing states, Joe Biden is right now, according to polls, losing to Donald Trump. And the only way he can win if he can energize his base core supporters. And that means young people. But young people, look at his policy on Gaza, and they don't see much to admire. In fact, they see a lot of things that they are revolted by. And then more broadly, one can also and should point out that the broader economic picture here in the United States does not look good for young people who are drowning in debt, who face very difficult economic prospects because the ability to get a job that can pay your bills and allow you to get married and to live a life similar to your parents or grandparents is becoming much more increasingly difficult. Young people also see the American political system as being very non-representative of the aspirations of young people. It's a political system that represents private and special interest groups, the moneyed class, people who are affluent, not necessarily the average American citizen or the average young person. So there's a lot of reasons to be disillusioned about the state of politics in the United States today. And if I had to predict right now what the outcome of the November election would be, I would predict, sadly, that Donald Trump would win. And that's a sad reflection on the state of democracy and the state of politics in the United States, where the two choices that Americans have is Joe Biden on the one hand, and I've just described him, and then essentially a fascist candidate on the other, who will make things probably 10,000 times worse if he gets elected. So that's where we are in the United States today.